On December 6, 1917, a flaming cargo ship drifted ominously toward a harbor on the Canadian Atlantic coast as stunned onlookers gathered in the docks to watch. In the next few seconds, something would happen that would go on to be one of the most deadly and destructive disasters in Canadian history. As always, viewer discretion is advised. By 1917, Halifax, Nova Scotia had established itself as a cornerstone of the Allied effort during the First World War. Because of its strategic position on Canada's Atlantic coast, the city's natural ice-free harbour made it one of the most important maritime hubs in North America. Its deep and sheltered waters provided a perfect secure base for assembling convoys, transferring supplies, and preparing troops for the journey to Europe. Halifax and its significance, however, predated World War I. It had also been a vital naval base for the British Empire, and the harbour had been central to military operations during the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the War of 1812. Later in the century, the completion of the Intercolonial Railway in 1880, along with the establishment of a deep-water terminal, positioned Halifax as a major link between inland Canada and the global trade routes. Economic decline struck briefly in the 1890s as local industries struggled to compete with those in central Canada. But by the early 20th century, this trend began to reverse, spurred by Canada's investment in naval infrastructure. In 1910, the Canadian government took control of the Halifax dockyard, transforming it into a command centre for the newly formed Royal Canadian Navy. So when World War I erupted, the city was thrust into a renewed and vital role as the British Empire's gateway to North America, which dramatically reshaped the city. Halifax's busy harbour soon became a central station for transatlantic convoys. Merchant ships would assemble in the expansive Bedford Basin, which was protected by anti-submarine nets and military patrols before being sent elsewhere. These logistical demands of the war then spurred rapid economic growth, and people from across Canada flocked to Halifax to work at its rail yards, shipyards, and waterfront factories. Women also entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, stepping into roles vacated by enlisted men. And by 1917, Halifax's population had surged to an estimated 60 to 65,000, straining the city's infrastructure and creating severe housing shortages. In the end, though, the scale of Halifax's contribution to the war effort was unparalleled in Canada. The port handled millions of tons of supplies, including coal, lumber, wheat, and munitions bound for Europe. Hospital ships also regularly arrived, carrying wounded soldiers back from the front lines, which led to the construction of a dedicated military hospital. The Royal Canadian Navy's operations in the harbour also ensured the steady flow of supplies and people. Despite this prosperity, however, Halifax was not immune to the dangers inherent in wartime operations. The sheer volume of traffic in the harbour increased the likelihood of accidents, and the presence of munitions-filled vessels heightened these risks. Protocols were in place to mitigate potential disasters, but the urgency to maintain supply lines often led to compromises in safety measures, drawing a precariously thin line between prosperity and peril. By December of 1917, Halifax Harbour was operating at peak capacity, and the volume of its maritime traffic had surged to unprecedented levels. Ships carrying volatile cargo had become a common sight to the port as vessels loaded with munitions and explosives were allowed to enter the inner harbour. This was a practice that was strictly prohibited during peacetime. And this decision, though essential to the war effort, introduced significant risks that were about to become profoundly apparent as two ships, the Norwegian SS Imo and the French SS Mont Blanc, arrived in Halifax Harbour in early December. The Imo, which was an empty relief vessel destined for New York, had been delayed in Bedford Basin, namely due to a late coal delivery that postponed its scheduled departure. This, combined with a tight schedule, made the ship's command eager to leave. By contrast, the Mont Blanc carried a cargo of 2,366 tons of picric acid, 250 tons of TNT, 62 tons of gun cotton, and benzol. All of these materials, again, were essential to the war effort, but extraordinarily hazardous to transport. On the morning of December 6, 1917, as the anti-submarine nets below the water were lowered to allow vessels to pass, the Imo and Mont Blanc found themselves on a collision course in a section of the harbour called the Narrows. This is a section where ships are expected to pass port side to port side, keeping to their starboard side of the channel. Instead of adhering to this, however, the Imo had already been navigating along the port side, having moved into the wrong lane earlier that morning while overtaking a tugboat. Traveling at a speed of over 7 knots, exceeding the 5-knot speed limit, the Imo forced a coal barge to steer closer to the shoreline to avoid a collision. Just prior to this, the Mont Blanc had undergone inspection and received clearance to proceed, and by 8:40 a.m. the ship was authorized to pass through the Narrows en route to Bedford Basin. As it traveled along at 4 knots and stayed within its designated lane, it observed the IMO encroaching in its path. But while there was still time and space to correct this issue, a series of miscommunications began. The Mont Blanc, traveling along the Dartmouth side of the channel, signaled its right-of-way with a single short blast of its whistle. The IMO then responded with 2 short blasts, indicating its refusal to alter its course. This response contradicted established navigation rules, which required the IMO to yield. And considering the 2 ships originated elsewhere, it might be easy to assume that one or both captains were simply unaware of local protocol. But at the controls of each vessel were actually Halifax locals. This is because the harbour is what's known as a compulsory pilotage area. In other words, navigating here is challenging enough that local pilots will actually board the ships to guide them into and out of the harbour. So aboard the Mont Blanc, Halifax pilot Francis Mackey repeated his initial signal with another single blast to reaffirm his right-of-way. The IMO, being piloted by local William Hayes, then again replied with 2 short blasts, insisting on maintaining its course. So growing increasingly concerned, Francis ordered the Mont Blanc's engines to stop and steer closer to the Dartmouth shore to avoid the oncoming ship. By this point, both ships had stopped their engines, but their momentum continued to carry them on a potential collision course. Then, as the 2 ships drew dangerously close, their crews attempted last-minute evasive maneuvers. Francis steered the Mont Blanc hard to port, crossing the bow of the IMO in a final attempt to avert disaster. At this point, they were close to parallel with one another. However, simultaneously, William signaled 3 short blasts aboard the IMO and reversed its engines, causing the ship's bow to swing erratically. This action, more than anything, sealed the inevitability of the collision. At 8:45 a.m., the IMO's bow struck the Mont Blanc's starboard side, puncturing its hull. And although the initial damage was not immediately catastrophic, the collision caused benzol barrels on the Mont Blanc's deck to rupture, spilling the highly volatile fuel into the cargo hold. Within moments afterward, these benzol vapors ignited, rapidly engulfing the deck in flames and threatening the ship's massive stores of picric acid, TNT, and gun cotton. Upon seeing this, the crew of the Mont Blanc, who were acutely aware of the explosive potential of their cargo, immediately abandoned the ship. They then rowed frantically in lifeboats toward the Dartmouth shore, shouting warnings in French about what they knew would happen next. Unfortunately, between the chaos and language barrier, their cries went largely unheard or misunderstood, and the burning vessel, which was by then an uncontrollable inferno, began to drift ominously toward the Halifax shore as a massive column of smoke spiraled into the sky, visible from miles away. Residents across Halifax were then drawn by the unusual commotion and gathered along streets, docks, and windows to witness the unfolding disaster. Crowds even formed at Pier 6, directly in the ship's path, as well as on nearby streets and rooftops, captivated by the fire in the water. Meanwhile, tugboats and other small vessels attempted to assist, but their efforts proved to be useless against the intensity of the fire. As the ship drifted closer to the shore, the imminent threat of a devastating explosion grew, unbeknownst to almost everyone. There was at least one witness who understood this danger, however. About 750 feet from Pier 6, where the Mont Blanc had drifted ablaze, Vincent Coleman, a railway dispatcher at the Richmond station, and a colleague were warned by a sailor fleeing the scene. The sailor's frantic explanation of the ship's contents caused both Vincent and his coworker to flee the area. As they ran, though, Vincent suddenly remembered the inbound passenger train number 10, scheduled to arrive in Halifax within minutes. Realizing that the train and its hundreds of passengers were headed directly into the disaster zone, Vincent turned back. Braving the approaching inferno, he returned to his telegraph station to send an urgent warning to halt all trains approaching the city. Vincent then tapped out the message, quote, "Hold up the train, ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys," end quote. Moments later, at exactly 9:04 a.m., the Mont Blanc's cargo detonated an explosion of unprecedented magnitude. The blast obliterated the ship instantly, vaporizing its structure and sending a shockwave rippling outward at a speed of more than half a mile or 1,000 meters per second. The energy released was so immense that temperatures at the epicenter reached approximately 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit or 5,000 Celsius, igniting a fireball that consumed everything in its immediate vicinity. And these effects were catastrophic. The shockwave leveled buildings across a 1.6 mile or 2.6 kilometer radius, completely destroying the Richmond district closest to the blast site. In this densely populated area, homes, factories, and businesses were reduced to rubble. The air blast even shattered windows as far as 62 miles or 100 kilometers, and the sound of the explosion was heard from more than 125 miles or 200 kilometers away. Thousands of people were injured by flying debris, collapsed buildings, and shards of glass that flew through the air. The explosion then caused widespread fires throughout the city as overturned stoves, broken lamps, and exposed electric wires ignited blazes that quickly spread among the ruins. These fires then engulfed city blocks, trapping survivors beneath debris and forcing others to flee. The Richmond railway yards, packed with freight cars and warehouses, were also completely destroyed, and the North Street station, which is one of the busiest in Canada, was heavily damaged. And this destruction also extended to Dartmouth on the opposite shore, where homes and businesses were also devastated. And horrifyingly, a tsunami caused by the sudden displacement of water in the harbour only added to the destruction. This wave, estimated to have reached a height of 60 feet or 18 meters, surged onto the Halifax shoreline, sweeping people, vehicles, and debris into the sea. The SS Imo, which had been damaged in the collision, was apparently even lifted by the wave and onto the Dartmouth shore. Fragments of the Mont Blanc were also hurled across Halifax with incredible force. Like, for example, the ship's anchor shank, weighing more than half a ton, landed nearly 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers away in Northwest Arm, where it actually remains to this day. Smaller pieces of the ship also rained down onto the city, further endangering those who had survived the initial blast. Vincent's telegraph message, however, reached stations along the Intercolonial Railway, halting incoming trains and saving countless lives. Passenger train number 10, which had been just minutes away from entering the danger zone, stopped safely outside the blast radius. And while Vincent's warning did not prevent the explosion, it ensured that hundreds of lives were spared. Sadly, though, selflessly going back to send the message cost Vincent his own life. In the moments following what is now known as the Halifax explosion, a stunned and battered city faced a monumental task. They would now need to rescue the injured and recover the dead amidst the chaos and destruction. The blast had leveled much of the Richmond district, trapping countless people beneath collapsed buildings and scattered debris. And fires continued to rage across the city too, so despite their own injuries and losses, survivors mobilized to help those in need, marking the beginning of a heroic but desperate rescue effort. This also meant that the first responders were literal neighbors and bystanders who dug through rubble with their bare hands, desperate to save those buried alive. Policemen, firefighters, and military personnel quickly joined the effort afterward, working tirelessly to contain the fires and rescue trapped residents. Additional fire brigades from nearby towns arrived throughout the day as well, and the Royal Navy, stationed in the Halifax harbour, played a critical role in the early rescue efforts. Sailors from surviving ships rushed ashore to assist, bringing medical supplies and equipment. British and Canadian naval vessels also acted as floating hospitals, and the American ships Tacoma and von Steuben were passing through Halifax at the time of the explosion, and they also diverted course to provide aid, sending rescue teams and supplies into the city. Despite the extra supplies, though, Halifax's hospitals were quickly overwhelmed by the influx of injured victims. The new military hospital took in more than 1,400 patients on the first day alone, with medical staff working around the clock. Makeshift hospitals were then established in schools, churches, and community centers to accommodate the growing number of wounded. Medical students and volunteers were also more or less forced into service, assisting with surgeries and tending to burns, fractures, and other severe injuries. Morgues were also set up hastily in public buildings as the city struggled to manage the sheer number of deceased. Later that afternoon, rescue trains from neighboring provinces and the United States began arriving, bringing doctors, nurses, and much-needed supplies. These trains also evacuated hundreds of the most severely injured to better equipped facilities outside Halifax. These efforts to transport survivors and deliver aid, however, were hampered by blocked roads and rail lines. And the situation worsened on December 7th when a heavy blizzard hit the region, slowing relief efforts. But simultaneously, it also extinguished many of the fires that had continued to burn. The Halifax Relief Commission was then formed almost immediately after the explosion and coordinated the city's response and recovery. The commission organized efforts to provide food, shelter, and medical care to tens of thousands left homeless or injured. Community organizations like the YMCA also converted their facilities into emergency shelters, while churches and charities distributed clothing and supplies. Amid this devastation, stories of extraordinary courage and resilience emerged as well. Railway workers risked their lives to clear tracks and evacuate the injured. Ordinary citizens opened their homes to strangers, children carried messages between rescue sites, and volunteers braved the freezing conditions to search for survivors and recover bodies. But although the immediate rescue effort lasted only a few days, the work of rebuilding Halifax would continue for years as the explosion left a devastating mark on the city both physically and emotionally. For starters, the sheer scale of the destruction was unprecedented. More than 2.5 square kilometers of the city were completely leveled, with the Richmond district bearing the brunt of the devastation. And many of the buildings that had withstood the shockwave were consumed by fires that raged uncontrollably in the aftermath. Streets were also impassable, littered with debris, wrecked vehicles, and the remnants of homes and businesses. The tsunami generated by the blast also compounded the destruction as waves surged into the city's waterfront, destroying docks, warehouses, and ships. In Dartmouth, the Micmac settlement of Turtle Grove was completely destroyed, leaving no survivors among the families who had lived there for generations. And the city's infrastructure, as you might imagine, were in complete ruins. More than 12,000 buildings were destroyed or heavily damaged, leaving an estimated 25,000 people homeless or without adequate shelter. And the extreme winter conditions on December 7th only exacerbated the suffering of those displaced. In the end, though, most tragically, the human toll of the Halifax explosion was immense. Roughly 1,600 people were killed instantly at the moment of the explosion, with the death toll rising to more than 1,900 as those who succumbed to their injuries in the following days were accounted for. Among the dead were entire families, kids on their way to school, and workers caught in the factories and offices. On top of that, a further 9,000 people were injured, with many suffering terrible wounds such as burns, lacerations, and fractures. The shattered glass throughout the city also blinded hundreds who had been watching the fires from windows of the streets. And in total, more than 5,900 eye injuries were reported, with 41 people permanently losing their sight. But again, despite the overwhelming loss, there were stories of miraculous survival. People were pulled from the rubble days after the explosion, and some who had been thrown by the blast landed in positions that saved their lives. One example was that of Charles Mayers, a sailor thrown nearly a mile from a ship. He landed on Fort Needham Hill, disoriented but somehow alive. Unfortunately, though, simultaneously, these stories were more like small glimmers of hope amidst the widespread despair. Families were torn apart, communities shattered, and a collective grief enveloped Halifax. In the wake of the disaster, the city grappled with not only the monumental task of recovery, but also the urgent need to understand how the disaster had occurred. And almost immediately, speculation and rumors began circulating. Many residents initially believed the explosion was the result of a German attack. The Halifax Herald newspaper even reported unsubstantiated claims that German nationals had mocked the victims of the blast, further fueling public outrage. As the dust settled and evidence mounted, however, it became clear that the disaster was an accident of human error and miscommunication. A judicial inquiry was then launched to determine the causes and assign accountability, beginning its hearings on December 13th, just a week after the explosion. The investigation then focused somewhat surprisingly on the actions of the Mont Blanc's captain, Aimé Lemedec, the harbour pilot Francis Mackey, and the chief examining officer responsible for harbour operations, Commander Frederick Wyatt. While many initially expected the blame to be placed on the IMO, key questions arose about why the Mont Blanc carrying such dangerous cargo had been allowed into the harbour without special precautions. And further testimony then revealed a series of oversights and procedural failings. Apparently, the Mont Blanc's crew had not flown warning flags to indicate the explosive cargo, which was standard wartime practice to avoid drawing enemy attention to munition ships. Meanwhile, it also found that the IMO, in its rush to leave port, had repeatedly disregarded harbour navigation rules, creating confusion and increasing the likelihood of a collision. On February 4th, 1918, the inquiry concluded actually placing primary blame on the Mont Blanc crew for failing to avoid the collision. Commander Wyatt was also criticized for his oversight of harbour operations. Manslaughter and criminal negligence charges were then brought against both crew, but the legal proceedings ultimately failed. A Nova Scotia Supreme Court judge then dismissed the charges, citing insufficient evidence. Subsequent legal battles then reached the Supreme Court of Canada, which ruled that both the Mont Blanc and IMO were equally at fault. However, when the case was appealed to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, the ruling shifted blame entirely onto the IMO, absolving the Mont Blanc. So as a result of all the confusion, no one was ever held criminally responsible for the disaster. The inquiry did, however, lead to significant changes in maritime regulations. New protocols were established to ensure safer navigation in busy harbors, including stricter oversight of ships carrying hazardous cargo and improved coordination between civilian and military authorities. And beyond the physical rebuilding, the disaster brought about social changes as well. The Halifax Relief Commission provided financial assistance and pensions to survivors, including those who had been permanently disabled by the explosion. The Commission's work also extended for decades, helping to rebuild homes and livelihoods. The Halifax explosion also had a profound impact on medical science, particularly in the treatment of eye injuries. The vast number of individuals blinded or partially blinded by flying glass prompted advances in ophthalmology, and the lessons learned in Halifax would later inform treatments for injuries sustained during World War II decades later. And today, annual memorial services on December 6th honor the victims and recognize the heroism of those who risked their lives to save others. Fort Needham Memorial Park, established near the epicenter of the blast, serves as a place of reflection and remembrance. and the site's bell tower is inscribed with the names of the victims and stands as a tribute to the lives lost and the resilience of the survivors. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member on YouTube. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.